Abraham Lincoln, learn English. Through history and expand your vocabulary and fluency. Follow the full story of one of the most beloved and tragic figures who ever lived, from a poor log cabin in Kentucky to the White House in Washington, from a boy who lost his mother at age 9 to the man who saved the Union and freed 4 million slaves. This is the story of a man who faced more failure than success, who suffered more tragedy than joy, and who refused to give up on his country. In this episode, you will hear his incredible journey. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a poor farmer and carpenter. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was a quiet and kind woman. The family had almost nothing. The cabin had a dirt floor, no windows, and a single door. Abraham slept on a bed of leaves and animal skins. When Abraham was 2 years old, the family moved to a small farm on Knob Creek. He remembered this place for the rest of his life. He would later say that his earliest memory was of a heavy rainstorm that flooded the creek. But life on the frontier was dangerous. Wild animals roamed the forests, food was scarce, and sickness was everywhere. In 1816, when Abraham was 7, the family moved again, this time to Indiana. The journey was long and hard. They traveled through dense forests and crossed rivers. In Indiana, they built a new cabin in the middle of the wilderness. It was called the Little Pigeon Creek Settlement. Abraham helped his father clear the land and plant crops. But the hardest moment of his young life came just 2 years later. In 1818, a terrible disease spread through the area. It was called milk sickness. It came from cows that had eaten a poisonous plant. Nancy Lincoln became very ill. For days, young Abraham watched his mother suffer. She died on October 5, 1818. Abraham was only 9 years old. He and his sister Sarah were left without a mother. The loss would stay with him forever. About a year later, Thomas Lincoln returned to Kentucky and married a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She arrived with her 3 children and brought with her something priceless: books. Sarah quickly won the hearts of Abraham and his sister. She encouraged Abraham to read and learn. She would later say that Abraham was the best boy she ever saw. Now, Abraham's formal education was almost non-existent. He attended school for less than 12 months in total. But he was determined to learn. He walked for miles to borrow books from neighbors. He read the Bible again and again. He read Aesop's Fables and learned its lessons. He read The Life of George Washington and dreamed of greatness. He read Robinson Crusoe and dreamed of adventure. He would read by firelight after a long day of farm work. He even carved his thoughts into a wooden shovel when he didn't have paper. But tragedy struck again. In 1828, Abraham's sister Sarah married and moved away. She was only 20 years old. A year later, during childbirth, she died. Abraham was devastated. He had lost his mother and now his sister. He was only 19, but he had already buried 2 of the people he loved most. He wrote a poem years later that expressed his sadness, saying, "My childhood's home I see again, and sadden with the view." In 1830, the Lincoln family moved once more, this time to Illinois. Abraham was now 21 years old, and he decided it was time to strike out on his own. He took a job ferrying goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. This was his first real look at the wider world. In New Orleans, he saw a slave market for the first time. He later said it was a sight that created a lasting hatred for slavery in his heart. After returning, he settled in a small village called New Salem, Illinois. Here he worked as a store clerk, a postmaster, and a surveyor. He was a hard worker and incredibly honest. One story says that when he was a store clerk, he once walked several miles to return a few pennies to a customer he had accidentally overcharged. This honesty earned him the nickname Honest Abe. He also began to gain a reputation as a storyteller and a wrestler. He was tall, over 6 feet, and incredibly strong. He once wrestled the local champion, Jack Armstrong, in a famous match. He didn't win, but he earned Armstrong's respect and a lifelong friend. But his real ambition was in politics. In 1832, he ran for the Illinois state legislature. He campaigned hard but lost. It was his first political defeat. But he didn't give up. Lincoln decided that if he wanted to succeed in politics, he needed to know the law. He began to study law books on his own, just as he had learned everything else. He would walk miles to borrow a book and spend his nights reading by candlelight. In 1836, he became a licensed lawyer. He moved to Springfield, Illinois, the state capital, and opened a law practice. In Springfield, he met a woman named Mary Todd. She was from a wealthy, well-known family from Kentucky. She was smart, ambitious, and well-educated. They were very different. He was quiet, often sad and reflective. She was outgoing and talkative. After a difficult courtship and one broken engagement, they were married on November 4th, 1842. They would have 4 children, Robert, Edward, William, and Thomas, known as Tad. Lincoln's law practice grew. He became known for his skill in arguing cases before juries. He had a simple way of speaking that people could understand. He traveled from town to town with other lawyers, riding on horseback or in buggies. He became one of the most respected lawyers in Illinois. He also returned to politics. In 1846, he was elected to the United States Congress for a single 2-year term. But his time in Washington was short. He returned to Springfield and focused on his law practice once again. The 1850s were a time of deep division in America. The issue was slavery. The country was splitting into North and South. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. It allowed new territories to decide for themselves if they would allow slavery. This infuriated Lincoln. He believed slavery was a moral evil. He was not an abolitionist who demanded immediate freedom for all slaves, but he believed slavery should not spread to new territories. In 1858, Lincoln was chosen by the new Republican Party to run for the United States Senate against the powerful Stephen Douglas. Douglas was a famous politician, short and stout, known as the Little Giant. Lincoln challenged him to a series of 7 debates across Illinois. Thousands of people came to hear them speak. In the first debate, Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." These words became famous. He was talking about a deeply divided country and the coming storm. The debates drew national attention. Lincoln did not win the Senate seat. Douglas was reelected. But Lincoln had become a national figure. His powerful words and his honesty impressed many people. In 1860, the Republican Party nominated him for President of the United States. He won the election. The Southern states were furious. They knew Lincoln was against the spread of slavery. One by one, they began to secede from the Union. Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States on March 4, 1861. In his speech, he pleaded for peace, but it was too late. Just a month later, on April 12th, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. The war would last 4 long, bloody years. It was the deadliest conflict in American history. Lincoln had to learn to be a leader in war. He had no military experience. He studied military strategy from books. He went through a series of generals who failed to win victories. He was frustrated and angry. He told one general, "If you are not using the army, I would like to borrow it for a while." He finally found a general he trusted, Ulysses S. Grant. The war was terrible. Thousands of soldiers died in each battle. Lincoln visited the wounded in hospitals. He wrote personal letters to families who had lost sons. His letters were full of compassion and sadness. One famous letter was written to Mrs. Bixby, a mother who had lost 5 sons in the war. He wrote, "I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming." But Lincoln was also facing personal tragedy. In 1862, his son Willie died from a fever. He was only 11 years old. Lincoln was heartbroken. He and Mary Todd locked themselves in their bedroom for days. He would often visit the cemetery where Willie was buried. Some say he even had Willie's body exhumed several times to look at it, unable to let go. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all slaves in the Confederate States were forever free. He said, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." This changed the nature of the war. It was no longer just about saving the Union. It was now about freedom. It also allowed black men to join the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers fought for their own freedom. Later that year, in November 1863, Lincoln was asked to make a few remarks at the dedication of a new military cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The battle there had been one of the bloodiest of the war. The main speaker, Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln then stood up. He spoke for only 2 minutes. His speech, the Gettysburg Address, was just 272 words. But it is considered one of the greatest speeches in history. In it, he said, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." He spoke of the soldiers who had died and said, "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." By 1864, the war was turning in the Union's favor. Lincoln was re-elected as president, defeating his former general, George McClellan. In his second inaugural address on March 4, 1865, he spoke not of victory, but of healing. He said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds." On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was finally over. Lincoln was overjoyed. He walked through the streets of Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. Black people ran up to him, knelt before him, and called him Father Abraham. He told them, "You are free. You are free." He returned to Washington. He was tired but hopeful. He was planning for the future. He wanted to rebuild the South and bring the country back together. He believed in forgiveness. On the evening of April 14, 1865, he met with his cabinet for the last time. He seemed peaceful and happy. He told his wife, Mary, they would go to the theater that night. It would be a light-hearted comedy called Our American Cousin. Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, arrived at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14, 1865. They sat in a special box above the stage. It was a joyful evening. The audience was laughing at the play. In the theater was a man named John Wilkes Booth. He was a famous actor from a family of actors. But Booth was also a Southern sympathizer who hated Lincoln. He had planned to kidnap Lincoln earlier, but had failed. Now, he planned to kill him. At about 10:15 p.m., while the play was at its funniest moment, Booth crept into the president's box. He fired a single shot from a small pistol. The bullet entered the back of Lincoln's head. Mary Todd screamed. Booth jumped onto the stage, broke his leg, and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, a Latin phrase meaning all tyrants will meet this fate. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house. He was laid on a bed too small for his tall frame. He never regained consciousness. Doctors did everything they could. But the wound was fatal. At 7:22 the next morning, on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood over him and said the famous words, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation mourned. His body was carried by train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, his home. Millions of people lined the tracks to pay their respects. Abraham Lincoln was dead. But his legacy lived on. He had preserved the Union. He had ended slavery. He had spoken words that would inspire generations. Abraham Lincoln, the boy from a log cabin who became one of the greatest presidents in American history, the man who held a shattered nation together, the man who proved that a single person born into poverty and suffering can change the course of history.